Good afternoon. My name is Timothy Hampton. I am the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to today's Berkeley Book Chat. The Berkeley Book Chat series features Berkeley faculty members in conversation about a recently published book. Today, it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Nicholas Paige of the French department talking about his new book, Technologies of the Novel, Quantitative Data and the Evolution of Literary Systems. He will be joined in conversation by Professor Dorothy Hale of the English department. Our guests will speak for about 45 minutes, after which they will open up the conversation to comments and questions from the audience. So feel free to use your chat function on YouTube to join the conversation. Before we turn to our main event, I'd like to make a couple of announcements about upcoming events. A week from tomorrow, on April 15th at 4 p.m. Pacific time, we will feature the last in our series of events titled Remaking Sense, the Humanities in Pandemic Culture. This event will be on image, on the changing role of images in pandemic culture and in the current moment more generally. For that event, we'll be welcoming Antonella Bonfanti from the Pacific Film Archive, Abigail DeKoznik from the Theater, Dance and Performance Studies Department, and Jeffrey Scholar from Film and Media. Second, on April 21st at 4 p.m., we will be hosting a roundtable of distinguished female faculty members to discuss the role of women, feminism, and gender in shaping the development of the arts and humanities at Berkeley. This is part of the 150W program, which celebrates the anniversary of the first women undergraduates at Cal. That event has been organized by Catherine Krim and will be moderated by Catherine Gallagher, Professor Emerita in the English department. So hope you'll join us for those two events. I would also like to point out that you can watch any of our recent Townsend Center events or any of our past Townsend Center events by going to the Townsend Center's website and clicking on the page that says watch, or you can follow our YouTube channel, which you're on now. This is the last of our Berkeley Book Chats for the year. And before we sign off, I would want to take a minute to acknowledge the extraordinary work of the staff at the Townsend Center over the past year. It's been a rough year, as you know, and their professionalism and commitment are what make possible events like this. And I think I can speak for all of us in the arts and humanities community at Berkeley in expressing our appreciation to the staff of Townsend. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn the floor over to Nick Paige and Dorothy Hale to discuss Technologies of the Novel. Welcome everyone back to the Townsend Center.
Thanks so much, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, Nick. I'd like to begin by congratulating Nick on the warm reception his new book has already received. At a recent event, one eminent scholar in 18th century French and English novel studies pronounced Technologies of the Novel to be the most important book on the novel since Ian Watt's field-defining The Rise of the Novel, published in 1957. I hope that in the time that we have today, we can especially work to understand the methodological approach that Nick develops in Technologies of the Novel. This approach yields an alternative explanation of the rise of the novel, which effectively clears Watt from the field. It also critiques the influence that Watt's idea of the novel's rising has had on the rise of novel studies as a field in the second half of the 20th century. So the stakes are very large. For those of you who haven't yet had the opportunity to read Technologies of the Novel, I want to launch our discussion today by introducing what I see as the project's four-pronged contribution and also provocation at the same time. So I'll try to lay those out from my point of view. And I hope, through our discussion, Nick, we can dig deeper into those key issues, and also in the discussion time that we have for the audience as a whole, we can go back to some of these ideas as well. Okay, so first contribution, provocation, or is your method inspired by work being done in digital humanities, right? Nick offers a quantitative history of the novel's evolution in France and England, a quantitative history. His archive includes over 2,000 novels within a 230-year time span. It focuses on the number and kind of novels published in France between 1601 and 1830, a 230-year span, and in England between 1701 and 1810, a 110-year span. Now, this method in and of itself required innovative thinking. Nick had to develop a sampling method of his own. And as you explain in the book, this sampling method wasn't part of the digital humanities toolkit, as you referred to it. The challenge of the archive and dealing with such a large archive was one that you had to figure out for yourself. And that's something that we might want to talk more about later today. The second contribution, and definitely provocation, is your larger theoretical inspiration as drawn from the field of science and technology studies. Especially useful to you is the work of Brian W. Arthur. And in the books, it seems to me, your largest interpretive aim is to describe, as you put it, the shape and contours of the literary system. So your idea of the system leads you to ask more specifically, as your question of inquiry, what is the pattern of formal innovation, consolidation, and decline of dominant forms of prose fiction within a specific historical span? And we'll want to talk more about your findings, some of them just to sample them, as it were. Some of them include that what the system yields for you is observation that formal innovations take a good deal of time to spread, that there's not a pattern of transformational innovation, that importantly, vis-a-vis the Watt thesis, there's not a continuous rise of a novel, but in fact, there are multiple rises that are gradual, peaks pass quickly, and falls look like rises in terms of their patterning. So those seem to me among your positive claims that the system model yields for you. Okay, but thirdly, your data-driven method and systems approach yields a very strong critical polemic in your work. And your critical polemic is addressed to a wide variety of popular scholarly methods. Among these are, and I'll list a few, you're challenging the genius model of innovation, the idea that a strong innovator creates something new and that's imitated and followed out by weak imitators until the next strong innovator comes along. And that, we could argue, is part of the Wattian view of the rise of the novel. We have strong innovators in Defoe and Fielding and Richardson. We have weak imitations until Jane Austen, et cetera. But you're also, in a different way, a different part of the polemic is you're challenging new and old cultural histories of the novel, and from Ian Watt to Catherine Gallagher, just mentioned by Tim in his introduction, that correlate the birth of the English novel and its subsequent generic dominance with the rise of the middle class and the cultural formation of the liberal subject. So among your bases of critique is you specifically object to what you call a modernist teleology of the rise of the novel. It's forever rising toward a modernist condition. That's one of your objections. You also, though, separately object to understanding cultural meaning and as related to the novel as in a tight fit of identification. So you're objecting to the notion that the novel as a cultural production is a tight fit of a reflection of a historical era or trend, or in the Foucaultian sense, is an instrument of ideological value that fits a historical era or trend. So, for example, Catherine Gallagher is one of your interlocutors in your book, and you object, you take different view of her argument that ties the rise of fiction in England to the development of a credit economy that she argues reconfigures the ideological relation of disbelief, speculation, and credit with the idea of fiction more generally. But you don't talk about D.A. Miller, but we could also include him as an example of the kind of work that you're critiquing in his novel, in his study, influenced by Foucault. Miller understands the Victorian novel as a social technology of normativization that serves the consolidation of class interest by confirming the novel reader in their identity as a liberal subject. So this is just the kind of new historical study that you want to question and sort of, as I say, clear the field and offer a different way of thinking about the novel as rising. You're on a very large scale challenging, it seems to me, a Foucaultian notion, more generally a whole Foucaultian approach to history and society, rejecting the idea of a cultural logic and an episteme. So, I go into this because I think these are really very, very high stakes and really exciting stakes that you're laying out here for the consequence of the new method that you're employing. On a more, sort of local level, as it were, you're also pointing out certain methodological mistakes that you feel people make when they do history. It's not just the tight fit between history and cultural production, but it's the way critics tend to, in novel studies, to use examples, right? You note that the prestige of the novel gets inflated. On the one hand, these huge claims are made, for hyperbolic claims from your point of view, as an agent or location of cultural value. But then you look at the method by which those claims are made, and you note the paucity of examples that that are used to as evidence for these large claims. And in a phrase that I think is quite pungent, you say these examples are cherry picked and lead to what you call magical reading of these examples, right? This inflation of value that is credited to just these few strong instances. So your data-driven approach is designed specifically to counter that method, as well as those grander claims made about the novel's value. So to describe, as you describe your own method, you say that what you want to do is offer an explanation that demands a recalibration of what counts as an explanation. Again, very elegantly formulated, an explanation that demands a recalibration of what counts as an explanation. So I hope we can get more into that right now. You also, formulate this positive part of your project by saying the richer our data, the more our explanations are constrained. And that's what you're looking for, is something that will hold us accountable to what you take as the factual nature of novelistic production. So your fourth contribution is where we might want to start our discussion. And that's with the positive claims that you want to make, that your book makes, about what literary history looks like when it's approached through systems theory. Because this is a book that is a literary history, I think. That's how I would describe it, by other means, as it were. So your systems theory leads to your own classification and formal description of dominant forms of prose fiction in the period. Categories like the Aristotelian novel, which you also call the somebody novel, the Hale novel, the inset novel, epistolary and memoir novels, third person novel, right? These are categories one could say that count as significant in the literary history that you're developing. And you characterize in your book the salient formal differences that distinguish these modes. And again, part of your method is to emphasize that you believe that this classification is derived from an empirical practice, what novelists actually do, that these categories kind of come from the ground up. So that on the one hand, I hope describes how you're doing literary history. So, but I also want to note what to me is a very important thread of your literary history as well. And it seems a little different than that empirical classifying approach, but maybe you can help me understand how the two go together, which is that you also at stake for you is an interpretive question that has to do with pinpointing the historical moment when novels seek to be validated by the claim that they report on true experience, and how that claim or that impulse develops over time, right? At what point do novelists feel that the issue of fiction and fictionality needed to be addressed, whether denied or admitted, and at what point did it cease to be an issue? So that is an ongoing thread of inquiry that goes across the whole book.
Yes.
Even as you're looking at the empirical method at stake. So I'm wondering, maybe we could start there with that big question and then go from there.
That's super. First of all, Dory, thank you so much for taking the time to do this under these technologically constraining circumstances, but also all the more because you're a modernist and I'm kind of an early modernist, and it's just really nice to have your perspective on here. So thank you for your generosity. So just speaking to that the last issue. This study was not designed, how should I say, methodologically, and then I didn't go from the conception of a needed study produced according to a certain method to the book. I devised the method in accordance with the question I had, right? And the question was a question regarding the now famous, thanks to Kathy Gallagher's, rise of fictionality. And in my previous book, I tried to do a kind of rise of fictionality argument for France, mostly inspired by Kathy's work. And I did it through the kind of familiar way that people write this type of history. That is to say, I took a bunch of pearls and I strung them together, the pearls being kind of canonical or pseudo-canonical novels from the French tradition. But as I was doing this, I kind of lost confidence in the method. I lost confidence that these novels could ever kind of prove anything like a trend in the way that fictionality was being conceived or used or that sort of thing. So that's why I kind of thought, okay, so the central problem in the rise of fictionality kind of narrative there is, so why were all these novels, especially in the first half of the 18th century, why did so many novelists pretend their novels were true? Right. And there's kind of plenty of obvious evidence of that. And some people are more ambiguous than others. But grosso modo, it's not hard to see that this is a strange artifact, right? This is a very strange artifact we have, literary historical artifact that has been noted for about a century, and people have explained in various ways before the rise of fictionality thesis. But what we really didn't have, I mean, we had no way of knowing exactly how long these truth claims held on, how widespread they were at any given moment. And so I thought the question needed to kind of be operationalized, to use a now fashionable word in literary studies, operationalized by coming up with some sort of way of measuring this, right? So that's kind of what propelled this turn towards the literary archive as something that needed to be kind of viewed quantitatively. So that's it. And then secondarily, I ended up developing kind of a theory, at least at the end of the book, on novelistic artifacts as technologies, thinking of them as technologies, as a way of explaining the changes in the record that the descriptive approach that I was taking uncovered, right? And then that's where I kind of came to develop kind of a theory of, well, what does it mean to talk about the evolution then of cultural artifacts? So that's basically it. That it's a book that's really driven by this question of fictionality.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just to follow up then, so then maybe you can say, for people who haven't read the book, what can you say more about what the quantitative measure changed for you? What did you learn from the measure once you started counting the instances of when these claims were made about fictionality, when they died off?
Because I had no idea what I was going to find, right? I had suspicions, right? But I wasn't quite sure what I was going to find. I was a little surprised in that the fall off of these claims in France, and there is a difference between France and England, the fall off of these truth claims in France was quite protracted. Basically, it takes place over the bulk of the 18th century, and actually even into the early 19th century, there's hardly what I call a trace presence of these fictional claims. They still tend to be made in anywhere from 15, 20, or even more percent of novels. So that was kind of one surprise, is that there was not really quite there wasn't a kind of a plateau of an incidence level that was kind of plateaued and then some brusque change. That was very much along the lines of what I saw in terms of these other kind of categories that I was trying to look at, be they simply kind of questions of first person versus third person, inset novels, you mentioned that sort of thing, is that I wasn't getting a lot of plateaus at all. These formal aspects of the novel that I was trying to isolate, they would grow usually after a fairly slow incubation period, and then they would grow, and then they would peak, and then they would fall off, and they wouldn't fall off quickly. They would really basically form a nice kind of, pyramid or hill like that, right? Things didn't have to be that way. I mean, I would have expected more plateaus, but there aren't really plateaus, at least on the level of the artifacts and the forms, the various things that I tagged for. On those levels, there weren't a lot of plateaus, and that was a surprise. But nonetheless, the intuitive takeaway of traditional literary history was certainly right in that these truth claims were quite prevalent in, say, the early 18th century, and basically by the turn of the 19th century they were no longer prevalent. So that certainly is established. Another element of the equation that I think never really made it into the earlier accounts of fictionality is the prevalence in the French tradition of something that I call the Aristotelian novel. And the Aristotelian novel is just a novel that takes well-known personages from history or legend, but usually some sort of history. Could be ancient history, could be more recent history. There's even a variant in which these Aristotelian characters are actually just contemporaries as well. But the idea of the Aristotelian novel is that the novels that are going to interest us are novels about people that we've already heard of, right? They're not about nobodies, to use Kathy Gallagher's resonant term that I modify a little bit, but I think it's really a great term. And basically, the earlier theories of fictionality, I don't think really weighed the importance of this novel. But the reason why it is important is not so much because these are necessarily great novels or because the French tradition is so important to the English tradition. But I think that, very deeply what is involved in the, let's call it I don't know, the fictional revolution or the fictional evolution in the early modern, turning into the modern novel, is really kind of an overthrow, or at least a sidelining of traditional Aristotelian thought about literature, about poetry, about why we read what we do, why it has effects on us, and why it has claims on our attention, right? All that in an Aristotelian frame comes from the importance of the subject matter, right? So art, the importance of art is indexed to the importance of its subject matter. In the visual arts, this could lead to kind of quite hierarchical kind of conception of painting, for example, where obviously you have historical painting and mythological painting on top, right? And you kind of go down toward paintings of domestic scenes until you get to fruit and vegetables, right? And all that, all that kind of artistic pecking order came from what was being depicted. And so, in a way, for me now, the truth, the mysterious truth pretense in the early novel, that no longer seems particularly mysterious to me. It seems to me to be simply a reflection of a very traditional valuation of well-known subjects. That is to say, heroes, people engaged in important actions, people of whom we have heard before, people of whom everyone is talking and has been talking for a long time. So that's kind of this Aristotelian mode. And so I see this kind of interregnum here that I call the pseudo-factual mode. It's a mode where we talk about people no one's ever heard of, but we pretend they are true. Seems to be actually kind of a logical kind of evolution in terms of evolution, or in terms of that breakdown of these Aristotelian hierarchies, ultimately producing a kind of different version of a different vision, a different version of artistic worth. So that's kind of how I ended up thinking about that. But just on an empirical level, there's no question that evolution is there. That is to say that the beginning of the 18th century, people tend to pretend their novels are true or write about real people, right? And the end of the 19th century, 18th century, when all of a sudden, we seem to be much more in Jane Austen's world, where no one's pretending that Darcy and so on are true people, right?
So that's fascinating. And just to follow, and it develops something, that you don't really go into in the novel, in your work. So I'm really grateful for that. So just to try to again, I'm thinking of people in the audience who may not have read the book, to try to concretize what you just said there in terms of the transition from the Aristotelian novel, as you're describing it, with known figures, to the invented characters that someone like Watt would emphasize, that is characterizing the rise of the novel. Could you just say, like you mentioned Clarissa in your study, but could you just maybe characterize more generally for people who may not have read your book, how you handle a novel like Clarissa, which in the rise of the novel studies is, considered to be foundational as a great origin, or kind of a work of innovation, work of genius, bringing, formal realism, to birth, and then inaugurating the imitators afterwards. So how does Clarissa look different in your study?
Well, Clarissa is different from no other data point in my study, right? But but some data points are more interesting than others. Is absolutely true. But you know, the easy answer is that Clarissa is no different from the Princesse de Clèves, for example, in the French tradition, or L'Estrait at the very beginning, the great pastoral novel from the beginning of the 17th century in France, L'Estrait by Dorothy. And it's not different really from Robinson Crusoe, right? That is to say that they are all kind of points in my analysis. Now, methodologically, there was a kind of question how we were going to weight the points. That is, what kind of weight how are we going to kind of ponder the difference between a novel that is published, you know, dozens and dozens of times, Clarissa or Rousseau's Julie, for example, from the flotsam and jetsam of the ephemera of the novel, because the greatest majority are never republished again, right? So that was a question, and I ended up doing, and I'm going to try to come back to Clarissa, you know, in specific in a second, but ultimately I decided that that I was simply going to measure the first publications of novels by the year of publication, rather than trying to take into account republications and so on, or lending libraries. One can imagine there would be different ways, books that are translated, right? Books that we can see circulated in lending libraries, that sort of thing. There are a lot of ways that you can kind of think about weighing the influence or the footprint of a novel. And ultimately, I decided against that. And partially, there are a lot of practical considerations involved. It's much easier and cleaner to do it in the way I decided to do it. But also, you know, if you are doing a history of innovation, it's really important not just to look at the winners, right? Because it gives you a kind of totally skewed point of view of how a situation is evolving. And we also have to remember, I phrase it, I think this way somewhere in the book, right, that a lot of forms, for example, that end up being winners were preceded by a lot of failure. So one way of putting that would be to say that it's not simply that a form just magically works and people adopt it, right? But people actually have to work on that form. They have to kind of continually refine things in order for it to work for them and then to spread. But to get back to Clarissa specifically, well, even before I get back, I'm going to shift gears just a teeny bit before I talk about Clarissa specifically. But it is important to realize that the type of history I'm proposing in some ways is not very interesting for the analysis of individual novels. I mean, it might be if you're reading Clarissa and you're kind of asking, geez, how many novels are this long at this time? Well, I do have statistics. I can show you not many million worders. Okay. Okay. That's very rare. So that'd be one thing. You also might wonder how many epistolary novels in the period feature such a gamut of letter writers, of characters, if you like, right? This polyphonic, what I just simply call a polyphonic epistolary novel, is that prevalent? How does that develop, right? And so I can actually provide some answers to that type of question. I'm not sure my book tells much about the genius of Clarissa or of Tom Jones or of Rousseau's Julie or anything like that, right? But it does kind of tell you in what respects are they representative. Okay.
Now, add Clarissa, you do mention that it had an influence. Correct me if I'm but you do mention how when the Clarissa's influence on the French novel tradition, or it's implied influence. So how would that fit into your calculation of the data point?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Clarissa is an example of, one might think of it as kind of a light bulb moment. That is, that there is something that happens in Clarissa, and it has to do with the polyphonic form of the epistolary novel. So earlier experimentations with the epistolary novel, basically in France, because there were very few in England. But in France, it has a long history going back to the end of the 1660s. Not particularly numerous history. It's not it's not extremely replete in terms of examples. But they tend to be books that are of exchanges of letters between lovers, right? And it's a very obvious model. Abelard and Heloise and so on and so forth. That's kind of intuitive, right? But the idea of kind of like putting together an epistolary gallery of all these letters sent between different recipients, recipients who can't really be imagined to have the other recipients' letters, right? So you're kind of imagining a letter collection of which I say in the book that there's really kind of no corresponding analog in reality. We had collections of letters on different subjects, for example. We had model letter collections, but the idea of kind of like grouping together letters sent between all these different senders into one, that somehow was something that was not intuitively available. That's an example of something that actually writers, artists need to work on to make that an option. Right, so that was a technology that really did need to be invented over time. But Clarissa ended up being kind of, it's a very early example of that. It takes the English kind of, it seems to be 15, 20 years though, to start writing that type of novel. It seems to happen a little quicker in France. But when we think of the 18th century epistolary novel, basically we're thinking about this polyphonic form. And Clarissa does really kind of catalyze that. It takes a while, right? I mean, it's kind of a long time before you see it in the numbers. English epistolary novels in the 1750s, in my sample, there were hardly any, and they didn't look anything like Clarissa, right? So it's only in the 1760s that you start to get them. There are other examples of novels that have a similar kind of role, and so I mentioned already the great pastoral, Dorothy's great pastoral L'Astrait at the beginning of the 17th century, and that is one that introduces to the French novel what I call this Heliodorian form, and the Heliodorian form, based on Heliodorus is the Greek novel. Ethiopica, is one that features in a third-person narration various flashbacks, right, where characters kind of meet, they tell each other stories, and then they flesh in these elements of the plot. And by the time you get to the end, everyone's told their story, and usually some sort of central enigma has been elucidated. And that structure, which kind of takes over the French novel in the second third of the 17th century, is very much imputable, if you like, to this novel to being. But others, like, a novel like Robinson Crusoe, for example, I mean, in terms of its kind of formal uptake, right? Not in terms necessarily of, I mean, if you want to read from Crusoe to a vision of the individual, that's absolutely fine. But in terms of its formal contributions, they would seem to be quite limited. The travel narrative, the first person kind of memoirs in England aren't particularly. So it really kind of depends on the case. There can be great novels that seem to do something to literary history, and a lot of great novels don't seem to do things to literary history.
Well, and I think what follows on that interesting explanation is maybe we could talk more explicitly about your idea of form, because again, just the way you were describing the literary history that you worked on and your findings, two characteristics would emerge. One where you're looking to define form is different than, say, Ian Watt, and he's looking at form as well, and coining the term formal realism, but that is a set of procedures for that aren't on your on your radar. You're describing form in different terms than he would, although you're both using the term form. So that's the first thing. And then, of course, the second thing is a point we've already made, but just to emphasize it again so we can get our mind around it. You're interested in something like Clarissa for, as an outgrowth, first of all, of a prehistory, right? Like not seeing it as Richardson inventing, this totally new form and things were forever changed afterward, but what is the prehistory to something like that? What is letter writing? Where did he get the idea of letter writing? Then the innovation of having a polyphony rather than, just total, coming out of the blue from a bolt of creativity. So two things then: one, your own idea of form, and two, your idea of innovation. And let me, just because I'm keeping an eye on the time as well, because I want to open things up to our audience in about 5 minutes or so. Let me say one more thing that will get again at the provocation of your book, which I so enjoy and want to frame whenever I can. So, you very deliberately are wanting to yank our chains by comparing the novel, literary work, to everyday material objects. So in your introduction, you say, the novel for you in your systems theory is comparable to an engine, a telephone, or a toilet. And I take that series very deliberately constructed by you. You're such a great writer and have such a sense of style. You end with toilet, okay? So there's a lot of defamiliarizing work that you want to be doing with your theory. And, I guess the large scale question is, I don't know where you want to start with this, but what's the value for you of comparing a literary work with an everyday material object like an engine, a telephone, or a toilet, when it's not material? I mean, it's material in its print, obviously, and you point that out, but you mean this in a different way than just its print form. So could you talk about
I do. I mean, so that's really important. So, I mean, I am considering these novel form as kind of as something that is inherent in the artifact itself, right? And one level, what I'm thinking of as form is kind of extremely basic, right? There are questions like, okay, how long is the book? Does it have chapters? Does it have these inset narratives? Is it in the third person or the first person? If it's in the first person, is it like organized like a memoir that is a tale of a life, or is it an episodic first person where, funny thing happened the other day to me, and I'm gonna, tell a story about that. So, I mean, here form is nothing fancy, right? With Watt, with I think most kind of historians of the novel, form is something a little more magical. I mean, think of the weight that people like to invest free and direct discourse with, right? It's an entire kind of way of thinking about the world, one that is at the intersection of the kind of complicated intersection of ideologies and so on and so forth. And free and direct discourse just does all this immensely complicated work, right? For Watt, I mean, the formal realism it's an entire way of orienting oneself towards the empirical world, right? So there's an entire worldview inherent in the novel form, right? But for me, it's something kind of much more nuts and bolts.
May I interrupt?
Yeah, please.
Because but if you're talking in your approach about the novel being the technology of the novel, or the system of the novel being a system of objects serving roughly the same purpose, right? System of objects serving roughly the same purpose, like the toilet or the engine. What would be the same purpose, right? Like when in that description of form that you just gave, what's the purpose that the novelists are aiming for in this
Right.
development of form, that we could compare it to, those other kind of objects.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, for a good bit of its history, certainly the novel has always been associated with love, right? A small story, generally of love, right? Samuel Johnson's definition. It hasn't been divorced from questions of adventure, however. Famous Huet's famous definition of the novel in the 1760s was, a story of love and adventure, right? And so adventure, even though Crusoe is not heavy on love, right, it certainly has an adventure element in it. Those definitions are maybe more or less applicable now. Things have perhaps changed somewhat, maybe not that much. At a certain moment, in the 19th century, we kind of get an idea that the novel is supposed to somehow be a description of the real world, right? That would be another kind of a purpose we might invent for the novel. And so when I say serving roughly the same purpose, it's basically the purpose that, people have long attributed to literature, or in Aristotelian terms, poetry, right? So that would be basically the purpose. But to say why that I think that is important to say, think of the novel as a collection of objects serving the same purpose. That gets to the question of toilets or engines, right? So when we think about the evolution of artifacts, we kind of have to realize that, and this is where Brian Arthur's theory of technological evolution really speaks to me, is that some forms of evolution, technological evolution, are continuous and others are not continuous, okay? So I like to use the example of, actually, let's switch to music, recorded music, right? Where we have the vinyl record, and we have the cassette, and then we have the CD, okay? And in some respects, then, if you're looking at the system of recorded music, we can see the one taking over from the other, and then one fades in and another one comes in, and that's graphable, and I actually there's a graph in the book about the evolution of recorded music. So what's kind of important to recognize is that sometimes these artifacts are akin to one another. Sometimes they are part of a continuous evolution. So between reel-to-reel and 8-track and cassette tapes, there's obviously an evolution, a continuous evolutionary way we can think of this. But there's no continuity between the cassette tape and the record, right? They are completely different technologies, but they are put within a system in which they are doing very similar things, right? And so that's basically how I want to think of novel forms, right? Novel forms as being part of a system in which they all kind of work basically toward the same goal. It depends a little bit on the writer. It depends maybe a little bit on what decade we're talking about, what century we're talking about, right? But these are all kind of recognizably similar things, right? But on the level of the formal artifacts, right, there can be no continuity whatsoever, right? So so there's no amount of people writing in Defoe's wake and under the influence of the travel narrative could possibly produce Clarissa, right? I mean, there's no continuity there whatsoever, right? But there may be a continuity on the level of the vision of the subject, for example, or the value of truth or chastity or whatever. I mean, chastity, I guess, not so much Robinson Crusoe, but you see what I mean, right? Yeah. So that was kind of a central issue for me to kind of explain that there's continuous evolution and there's discontinuous evolution. Anyway.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that gets at the heart of the method question. So I really appreciate we had time for that. Now I'm keeping an eye on the time. I see we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I would encourage anyone at this point who has a question to put it in the chat. Okay, I'm going to read one of the questions here. It says, the novel seems to be at once international and national. Can you talk about that? and about, for example, other traditions that you don't address.
Mhm.
Spain, where some people say the novel came
Uh-huh.
from, question
Uh-huh.
mark. In the same sense, okay, part two of the question, aren't you in the end focusing on two national spaces
Mhm.
where there is in fact a rising middle class? So it seems, okay, two different hefts to the question. I think the first one is about what would you do with other national traditions and how might they fit into this rise of fictionality or charting of fictionality. And then the second is, well, still there is a rising middle class in all these places. What do you make of it? So.
Right. I mean, in terms of other national traditions, I mean, people are welcome to. Spain is interesting. I mean, because like I have not found any, or I'll say I've found precious few scholarly monographs on the 17th century Spanish novel. I mean, sure, everyone wants to go to the Quixote, right? But when it comes to kind of like a continuous, some sort of kind of continuous or coherent production of novels in French, there's the Spanish novella. That's very important toward the, in the first half of the Spanish 17th century. But I would kind of contend that there's really not a lot of there, and that if you want to maintain the contrary, that's fine. Just show me the stuff, right? France is extremely precocious in its interest in the novel. England cannot match it. I mean, that's another kind of point of my thing is basically the reason why we get these amazing narratives of the rise of the English novel is because there's nothing at the beginning of the 18th century and there's lots of stuff at the beginning of the 19th century, whereas in France there was still plenty of stuff at the beginning of the 17th century, and so that kind of terminology is not really used. For the question of the the famous middle class, I mean, I that's okay, but I mean, the middle class is always rising. So what would, I'm not sure it really explains any of the changes that we can actually map out empirically. In both England and France, the moment when the novel really takes off is like 1770s, 1780s. And the parallelism in the rise is incredible to my sense. I mean, just the graphs in chapter 9, where I just kind of compare novel production, it's just so similar that it's kind of uncanny. Anyway, but so really is the middle class in the 1780s that much more resplendent than it was in the 1750s or 60s? And how would we possibly measure that in order for that to be a useful category? And it might work in England, but then I think it would also leave us really without any way of thinking the long and interesting history of the novel in France in the 17th century. I guess the middle class rose, and I guess the middle class is responsible for reading some novels. But beyond that, I don't know. It's certainly not a hypothesis that'd be very good for explaining, for example, the importance of the Aristotelian novel, which deals with basically kind of important heroes of the past. The Aristotelian novel has a certain type of social hierarchy built into it. Right. Anyway.
And this might be, I mean, there are some other questions I want to get to, but just to quote you from your book on the same point here, you say, again, you want to turn the focus away from these ideological accounts to looking at this impersonal system that accounts for what you're calling the technological development as a continuous, contingent, heteronymous process engaged in by multiple human agents whose independent actions nonetheless form a system. And another provocative way that you put this, again, in your demystifying endeavor, you say it's a lot of different people who made a lot of different decisions for a variety of reasons, and that's how it turned out. So you're really making this strong demystifying claim. I just want to keep that in our focus. But let me turn to a couple more questions that are tumbling in here. Okay. Well, one I think very useful question would be, could you talk about your relationship to the well-known work of Franco Moretti, which seems to cover similar issues?
So, basically, I think Franco Moretti's work specifically, as opposed to other people who do distant reading, okay? So I don't know, so especially Ted Underwood, for example. So Franco's work, Franco obviously is a pioneer in the sociological study of forms, as, which is a subject also dear to your heart, Dory. And so I feel that what Moretti tends to do when he has quantitative information is he tries to come up with a sociological explanation for it. So the sociology of form is no longer happening on the level of text, it's happening on the level of the archive. Obvious example is his analysis of the shrinking lengths of titles in titles of novels from the 18th to the 19th century, right? And he comes up with this kind of a sociological explanation of why that makes sense, right? And in fact, Moretti's writings tend to be peppered with the phrase, and that makes perfect sense because, right? Because he's doing this thing where you alluded to the tight fit between forms and cultural formation, cultural ideological, right? I think I put it in the book. I say there's like a satisfying snap when you're able to take your empirical observation, right, and then find the perfect kind of ideological cause of it, right? Because it looks right, it seems to fit together so perfectly. So I think Moretti tends to do that a lot in his work, and I don't.
Okay, great. Now, again, a number of other questions coming in, so let me try to get address the variety of question that you're getting. So here's one that asks, does your model discuss and or how audiences are addressed, constituted, etc., and do you care?
Yeah, I mean, how they are addressed. I mean, in a large sense, the whole truth pretense and the way I follow the truth pretense, the way I operationalize that, and the way I measure it, I mean, is in addresses to the audience, essentially prefatory material, right? But beyond that, I'm not really interested in readers. I say that I assume some sort of feedback loop between audiences and writers, but it's a black box. I don't go into that. It's not that I'm not interested in it. I just can't measure it here, just as I haven't. There's a lot of social identities of these various actors I don't take into account. I don't take into account gender. I don't take into account where their novels are published. And I think that these could be really interesting other questions, but I don't consider them, and I think it's okay that I don't consider them, just because the results that I've found, I found patterns. I mean, basically the existence of whatever I'm measuring is, I think, how shall I say, the choice of my measurements is somehow confirmed to me by the fact that I haven't uncovered noise, but that I've actually uncovered patterns. Now, it may be that those patterns are illusory, and that if I chop things up differently, I'd find that they are, or that at least some of them are kind of optical illusions, just because I thought I was asking the right questions, but I wasn't. So that's possible. But the question of readers, unfortunately, no, that's not really part of the study. It's a study of producers.
Maybe one last question as we had 1 minute to one, but this is from Simona Zetterberg, who works
Oh,
in
yes.
your
Hi,
area.
Simona.
Hi, Simona. It says, have you found examples where pseudo-factual declarations were not meant to be taken seriously, maybe ironic, or even could be seen as a sign of fictionality?
Right.
So maybe just a quick address to that.
Right. So one of the questions I decided to bracket when I started operationalizing this kind of this question was how people were reading these declarations. Did they take them seriously? Did they not take them seriously? One kind of easy hypothesis that certainly has been made before is that, well, once upon a time when these were new, people really believed this. They were very naive in terms of their consumption of novels. And then, as the novel goes on, as they read more of these prefaces, they realize that this is much more of a wink situation, right? And they start to kind of catch on to, oh, I don't think this is true, and yet I'm taking pleasure in it. Maybe that's what fiction is, right? So there's kind of this idea of an audience that needs to wise up somehow to a type of truth that is the truth of fiction, right? And I tend to just kind of put that aside. I don't think it's a very good model. I don't think it explains very well the data. It leads to the postulation of earlier publics as being more credulous than later publics. So there's a whole kind of host of kind of chauvinistic reasons. I don't think that's a good way to think of things. But just as just very quickly, I'm just going to just as a tagger, because I go in and I tag things. I have to say whether I think there's a pretense of truth or not. There were plenty of pretenses of truth that I found actually very convincing. I was convinced that this was a true story. Okay. And there were others where obviously it was barely half pretending, right? But yes, but beyond that, I don't want to draw any real conclusions. For me, what just counted was that over time, the number of these pretenses to truth, it just becomes more and more rare, right? So it's not really a question. But that said, there are graphs in the book where I note equivocal pretenses of truth and ironic pretenses of truth. So I did code that when it was kind of overt irony. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Nick, and everybody who came today. Obviously, we could, fill another hour going into the complexities and provocations of your book. I encourage everybody to buy it and read it. And I just want to say, on a personal level, I just want to thank Nick for all of your collegiality and working together with you over the years as we think about the novel in our various ways, and for the benefit that all of us at Berkeley have had to discuss your ideas with you as you've developed them. And I just want to point out also, in the spirit of what we've been discussing today, your book is very much could be considered a response to the way that novel studies have been formulated at Berkeley and how they've shaped the field. And when we think of institutional environments, we'd also want to remember that Ian Watt wrote The Rise of the Novel at Berkeley when he was a Berkeley faculty member. But of course, your project would want us to move away from that kind of institutional thinking of influence and origin. And that inspires me to think that somebody might be writing one day in a meta move the history of novel studies at Berkeley from a systems approach, and where you and I would both fit into that is so fun to think about. So thank you for all of that, and thank you for everybody.
Thank you, Dory. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.